Hey, Pelahatchie. It is a wet and rainy Wednesday, and I am here with a Bible study coming from 2 Timothy for us to work through, and it's timely. The Lord gives some very helpful and thoughtful guidance for us of things happening this week. I hope that your family is ready for the Sahara Desert that's coming this week. Didn't have that on my Armageddon bingo, but I hope you've had a good week. I'm looking forward to studying God's Word together. Get your Bibles out. Open your app. We're going to be in 2 Timothy chapter 2. We're going to take just a couple of verses following where we were last week. You can remember what we've been doing and talking about is Paul's personal encouragement to Timothy, his protege, the pastor at the church in Ephesus, just encouraging him in what is a difficult time and place. Timothy's struggling with ministry, and Paul is trying to keep him on task and keep him on mission. We're going to pick up in 2 Timothy chapter 2 in verse 14. He says, remember, let's just read like the paragraph and we'll come back and look at it. He says, keep reminding God's people of these things. Warn them before God against quarreling about words. It's of no value and it only ruins those who listen. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. Avoid godless chatter, because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly. Their teaching will spread like gangrene, and among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have departed from the truth. They say that the resurrection has already taken place, and they destroy the faith of some. Nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm, sealed with this inscription: the Lord knows those who are his. And everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. Start with what he says in verse 14. He says, keep reminding God's people of these things. This is a good bridge in connection to what it is we've been talking about. What's he reminding God's people about? Well, the importance of endurance, the importance of faithfulness. That's what he's saying like in verse 11, 12, and 13. And obviously that's building off the things that Paul's been saying to Timothy himself. So you can hear Paul encouraging Timothy, but not forgetting about the church and recognizing that there are things that he's sharing with Timothy that will be helpful for the people there, especially you imagine Timothy gets a letter from Paul and the leaders and people are, they're reading over his shoulder. Timothy's sitting at a table reading through the papyrus, and I'm sure they're reading over it too. And Paul knows that. So he shares this encouragement to them also, keep reminding them that they need to know about these things. They need to focus on endurance. They need to focus on being faithful. They don't want to overlook any of these things. So he says, remind them about these things and then warn them before God against quarreling about words, because it's of no value and it only ruins those who listen. So warning against quarreling about words. So that quarreling about words is what the NIV says. King James is going to say about words with no profit, or words to no profit, meaning they have no benefit. They don't do anything. The Message, which I love, it's a modern version. It says he warns them against pious nitpicking. And I want us to think. We're going to spend a couple minutes here thinking about what does Paul mean by this? What is this thing that he's warning Timothy and the church in Ephesus about? Well, it's the idea of word splitting, about arguing over minute language and unimportant topics. It's the idea of focusing your attention on secondary issues. Because Ephesus has huge problems. They've got heretical things there. There are heretical teachings happening in the church. You heard him call out these two guys in verse 18, 19, 17. He calls them out. So there's heretical issues there. There are economic issues there. There's obviously ministry and evangelism issues there. And Paul's saying, stop. Don't let yourself get distracted with secondary issues. Don't get focused on minor things that then keep you away from being able to focus on major things. It's like for an example, if y'all remember, this has been 17 years ago, 2003, Congressman Walter Jones got really upset about the fact that France wasn't helping us in the war against Iraq. You remember that he wanted to rename French fries Freedom Fries. Especially in the cafeteria there in Congress, and that wanted to kind of spread that across the country and whatever. It was silly. And it's one of those things where, I see what he's trying to do, but he's focusing on the secondary issue, which means then that people aren't going to want to listen to him when he speaks on primary issues again. Does that name ring a bell for you at all? Do you have any idea who Walter Jones is? No. Because when you engage on secondary issues, then you get distracted from and aren't able to, or at least aren't listened to when you come to major issues. You think about what Paul is then saying to Timothy and obviously to everyone else there in Ephesus, warning about getting engaged with quarrelsome words, getting engaged in these secondary things. That if Timothy, especially as a leader, and the whole church is drawn into heated debate over minutia, over minor things, then he's going to be distracted from major things like evangelism, like fighting against the presence of heresy and doctrinal truth. And he's possibly going to lose the respect of others and the ability then to speak to major things. It's like churches who fight over color of the carpet when we don't even talk about evangelism and we can't baptize anyone in the course of a year. We don't get distracted by minor things. We have to focus on the major things. And this is why, like pastors, for instance, and even good politicians, but pastors don't address every incident or topic. Everything that comes up in the news and the media, everything that even comes up in the life of the church, like your pastor, I'm not going to address that. I won't get dragged into the mud and risk my ministry reputation over minor issues. I'm not going to do that. Which is why then, like when I do speak, when I do find an issue that needs to be addressed and I speak, you'll know hopefully that it's important, and hopefully then you'll maybe listen and engage with what I say. And that's why, like, let's be timely about this, about what's happening in our life this week. Like, that's why I'm speaking about the Mississippi state flag issue. You've probably seen things that I've put on Facebook, and if you know me and have any history with it, you know that I've talked about this before. I talked about it several years ago and lost church members over it. I'm talking about it again now and probably will lose church members over it again. But it's important enough that it requires my attention. And because this isn't a secondary thing. Like a lot of people say, oh, the church shouldn't be talking about politics. Church shouldn't be dragged into this. And guys, that is the wrong answer to this. The idea of the state flag and the symbolic problems that it represents are not secondary issues. I've already seen people actually quote this verse from 2 Timothy as why we shouldn't speak about the flag, saying that it's a secondary thing, or we're just quarreling over words, or we shouldn't be engaged in politics. And guys, that's wrong. It's just wrong. Like, we as the church, like, we must engage. We absolutely have to talk about politics at times, but we have to talk about this issue because we, as the church, need to speak on this thing because it deals directly with our mission and our ministry of reconciliation. Think about things that Paul writes, all right? So he's obviously talking to Timothy here, so we'll follow his train of thought, say, to the church in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says this, these things are from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ and not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. That the ministry, the job, the desire of God for reconciliation of the people to himself and therefore the people to one another, like that is the ministry and the mission of God. That's what he's trying to do. And then he's entrusted that to us. We are his ambassadors. We're the ones that are going to make it happen. And think about something else that he says, like in Romans chapter 12, Paul speaking to the church in Rome, he says, if it's possible, if anything within your power, he says, live peaceably with all people. That we, as the followers of Christ and the ambassadors of Christ and the image bearers of this ministry and mission of reconciliation, that we are to pursue all efforts of reconciliation between man and God and man with one another, and to live at peace with all men. Meaning that if there's something we can do that helps reconcile people to God, and if there's something we can do that helps reconcile people to one another, we have to consider that as part of our gospel ministry. So we look at the issue of the state flag and we look at how divisive it is. We look at the symbolism that is there and how corrosive it is, even if it may not have been intended that way. If you don't believe that, whatever, but just in the way that it's been used, even in our lifetime, to recognize that this is not reconciling people. It's actually divisive, and it's hurting the people. It's hurting the church, meaning that this isn't a secondary political issue. This is a primary gospel issue for us to talk about reconciliation and to pursue it even into the political realm. So Paul warns Timothy in Ephesus, like, don't get into quarrelsome words. Like, you've got to talk about primary issues. Matter of fact, that's what he's going to talk about in a second, is about calling out heretics, about dealing with the foundations of the Christian faith and talking about that. Like, so that's what we do, and that's why we have to engage on that subject. But then he backs up and go back to his original thought about how we don't fight over quarrelsome things. Why? Like, why is that bad? Why is it dangerous? Why does it ruin people? Well, look at what he says. He says it's of no value, and it only ruins those who listen, meaning that fighting over quarrelsome words, it leads to arguments, in that we tend to tear people down in our effort to win an argument. When we get into secondary issues and we're fighting with quarrelsome things, it often no longer is about the thing itself. It's no longer about an ideal. It's no longer about even our mission or our ministry. It's about my own victory. It's about me wanting to win and the importance of me being right, meaning that I'll do anything to you to make sure that I end up being right. So we tear people down. We ruin other people in an effort to win an argument over something that didn't even matter, which means then that what Paul tells us, say in Ephesians 4, that our imperative, that our command there about building others up, about only speaking what is helpful and building other people up, like that ministry and that expression of the gospel in the way that we speak, that can never happen when we're quarreling over secondary things, when we're fighting over insignificant things. So what's Timothy supposed to do? Like, he's reminding people about, being faithful, and then he's supposed to warn them about not quarreling. So what's Timothy as the leader? How is he supposed to step out in front of this and show the people what to do? Well, that's what Paul says in verse 15. He says, do your best. And this is to Timothy, and not that it's not to the church at Ephesus, but I think Paul's turning his attention back to his primary audience, to Timothy himself. Do your best, then, to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. What does Timothy do to kind of end or cut off this type of ruinous speech in his church? Well, one, he's got to be a man of good conduct. All right, that's what it means to present yourself to God as one approved, meaning to live according to the ways of God, to live to be a man or a woman of character, of integrity. Be of good conduct, be approved by God. Second, to work hard enough to never be ashamed. That's what he says. A worker who does not need to be ashamed, meaning that you've done your work, you've done your homework, you've made an effort so that the words that come out of your mouth, so that the things you choose to do or to say, you'll never have to be ashamed of it because you've actually studied or thought before you did it. You've not shot off at the cuff. You've not engaged in a conversation that really didn't need to be engaged in, which this is Paul's like subtle way of telling us to think before you speak, to study before you speak, to research before you post anything. Don't just mouth off, because then that engages you often in secondary issues, and engages you in things in a non-Christian way. So he says, work hard enough to never be ashamed. Do your homework before you engage in something. And then to handle the gospel correctly. He tells Timothy to be someone who correctly handles the word of truth. What is that? What is the word of truth? What is the gospel? It's this, that God loved this broken and rebellious world enough that he sent Jesus here to live, to die, to be resurrected in order to reconcile that broken world to himself. That's it. That's the word of truth. That's the gospel, that God, in his love, sent Jesus to reconcile us, and then has entrusted that ministry of reconciliation to the church who has been left here as Christ's ambassadors, now that Christ has returned to his rightful place of glory. So this is what Paul does. And this is like what then we do. Like, this is the ethic that comes from this. If we're wanting to keep people on message, if we're wanting to keep people on being faithful, if we want to stay on message and we want to be confident, sure, and true about the ministry and the message that we have to share, well, then we need to be of good conduct. We need to be people of integrity who have done their research and who think and pray and read and study before speaking and engaging, and who handle the gospel well, who come back to the gospel at every issue and at every point, constantly reminding people that God has come to redeem them, and how can we be part of that reconciliation. So Paul continues his thoughts here. Like he has this conversation with Timothy, and he continues his thoughts with warnings against godless chatter in verse 16, which is, I think, just an echo. Like, he's just building on the same idea. And then he calls out people who have done godless chatter. He talks about Hymenaeus and Philetus. Like, he's willing to call out men who are speaking in an ungodlike way, who are handling the truth poorly, who are heretics, essentially. He calls them out. And then he ends with verse 19, which is a word of encouragement. Look at what he says. He says, God's solid foundation stands firm, and it's sealed with this inscription: the Lord knows those who are his, and everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. He's telling us that, like, God is sovereign. He's in control, and his people are in his hands. And boy, that gives me confidence and strength to be able to speak out when necessary, and to not speak out when it's not worth it. It also means that his people will naturally turn from evil. His people will naturally turn from false teachings. His people will naturally pursue good conduct in this desire to be approved by God. You want to know whether or not you're part of the people of God? Look at your heart and your natural inclinations. I think what Paul tells us here, like the little ethic coming from this, is to be careful about what conversations you engage in, and to be careful about how you engage in those conversations. That if it's holy, if it's worth it, if it's connected directly to the gospel and this ministry of reconciliation that he's entrusted to us, then you have to engage in that subject, and you do it with vigor, with zeal. And if it's not holy, if it's not connected to this ministry of reconciliation, then don't hurt other people, and don't endanger your reputation by engaging in it.